All right. So, welcome to the Examine Life podcast conversation. My name is Nathan McCullough, and I am an integrative nutritionist, a holistic health coach. Do a lot of work in addiction recovery and using a lot of some of the methods and some of the approaches to philosophy that we're going to talk about today. In regards to leadership and I guess kind of applied phenomenology and ontology in my life and into a lot of coaching practices. And I'm really specifically interested in the impact of this kind of ontological, phenomenological approach to coaching and working with people and helping facilitate, let's say, the ontology part, the identity level transformations in people by using some of these methods. So I'm excited to embark on this journey. So the Examine Life podcast is really going to be a series of conversations with other philosophers and thinkers and practitioners about, how to live a life well lived. Using different disciplines and different ways of being and thinking and acting in the world. And, specifically we'll be talking about kind of how philosophy can not only enrich our lives and give our lives a sense of purpose and meaning, but also, as John Vervaeke says, to help us awaken from, what ostensibly occurs like a meaning crisis, and how philosophy can kind of have that transformative impact on life. So that's kind of our mission here at Examine Life. And our guest today is the esteemed Casey Rentmeester. And yeah. So I will begin by kind of giving a little bit of a biography of Casey, not a biography, an introduction, and then kind of let you pick up from there. But I'm excited because Casey and I went to Kent State University together and studied philosophy together. We have a lot of, I think, interests that intersect. And, I've kind of broken off and decided not to go the Ph.D. route and go different routes and do different things. But Casey has gone the academic route and is teaching at Bellin College in Wisconsin as an associate professor, and has a area of specialization is environmental philosophy and is it bioethics and using the thought of Martin Heidegger, who's also one of my philosophical heroes, and doing, I think, really important work on the intersection of these areas, right? Medical ethics and environment and phenomenology and philosophy. So Casey, why don't you fill in a little bit, anything that I missed about what you're up to?
Yeah, so I specialize really in applied phenomenology. That's the best way to kind of put what I do. I teach at a really small health sciences college. So a lot of my work is in medical humanities. So basically, what does it mean to empathize with your patients? So we think through those questions, typically from a Heideggerian lens. But I wrote, my first book is on phenomenology of the environment. How does the environment show up to us? So questions like that. And how do we treat it? And how does our human behavior towards it tell us what it means to be human? So those are the kind of questions that have kind of guided my work in environmental philosophy. So those are kind of the two camps I work in. And then I do a bunch of stuff on philosophy of music, just because I like music. So I do a lot on that as well, which ends up being in these like pop culture, pop philosophy type stuff. So that's kind of fun stuff to do on the side.
Fantastic. So, and you mentioned, so I mentioned ontology and I mentioned phenomenology in my introduction as well. And you said that you're really kind of focusing on applied phenomenology. So why don't you, I guess we can start by just sharing a little bit about what is phenomenology and what does it mean? What does it mean to you to start, and then why is that approach specifically important in the medical field that you're working in?
So phenomenology is a study of how the world shows up to you from a certain perspective or context. So essentially, when you're doing applied phenomenology, you're thinking through not just like how you are experiencing the world, given your background, but also if you're dealing with patients, how they're experiencing the world from their background. And the real goal in medical humanities and the work that I do is helping to train medical professionals how to listen to their patients and respect them as authorities of their lives, and get to know what it means, what they value, what it means to be them, so that you can better care for them. So that's kind of how the realm of phenomenology of healthcare typically comes at it, is let's think through what it means to be you, and let me use that as an essential information in the treatment plan.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's interesting because I've been doing this kind of transformational coaching work for almost 10 years. Well, yeah, in 2011, so 10 years this year. And the way that they phrase that is by the idea is getting into the other person's world, right? So like getting into their world and then having a conversation from there, right? So instead of trying to understand someone else from your own perspective, like trying to get inside of the context and the perspective of the other person and thinking from there. So
Right.
is that similar? It sounds like that's similar to what you're saying.
That's precisely what it is. So it's basically hermeneutics, right? So it's a study of interpretation. How can I understand the way in which you're viewing things and what matters to you, which might be different than what matters to me, but I need that information to have a genuine dialogue with you so that we can get you where you want to be in terms of health. So it's very much exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, and how do you, I don't know if define is the right term, but we've also, like you mentioned, to be someone, and I mentioned earlier about, this kind of ontological approach. So does the ontological approach come in to the approach that you're talking about as well? And how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, ontology is just the study of being, right? So what does it mean to be? That's the question of ontology. And so if you're doing phenomenology, you're automatically doing ontology too, because you're trying to ask the question, what does it mean to be this person? What does it mean for this person to come to me and seek expertise or consultation to deal with something that they themselves cannot fix themselves? So that idea of phenomenology, ontology, and then in a healthcare setting, empathy, these three all go together. They have to go together if you're doing it well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I do see when you really appreciate and you do phenomenology well, like you said, and you come at it from that ontological perspective, which is like trying to think through what it means to be that person. I feel like empathy is required in order to do that well.
Yeah, and basically when you think through empathy, typically you make a distinction between cognitive empathy, which is kind of like knowing where somebody's coming from and understanding their position, their perspective, versus more so like emotional empathy, where you're feeling the same feelings as that person. So what we do in phenomenology of healthcare, and when we run workshops or teach this stuff to our students, is we try to train them in cognitive empathy. So even if you haven't, necessarily gone through the same illness or the same sort of disease that your patient is going through, kind of understanding what it means to go through that, right? What does it mean for somebody's world to be upended because of a cancer diagnosis or something along those lines? So that, I think, if you don't have that attitude of openness where you're willing to kind of open yourself up from another person's point of view and glean in and figure out, well, what does that look like? You're not really doing healthcare well.
Yeah, that's interesting because one of the areas of extreme interest that I have at the moment. I did another podcast with a friend of mine, Johannes Niederhauser, and the topic was on human flourishing. But the majority of our conversation actually centered around death, specifically within Heidegger's thought, and this idea of, not death as the ceasing of life or like that, but like essentially mortality and finitude, and not the eventuation of the possibility of dying, but the way that your life can be informed with let's say an appropriate relationship to the fact that it is possible at every moment, and kind of allowing that awareness to inform your understanding of what it means to be a human being at all, and not just your own unique particular situation. And I feel like when that's done well, right, a lot of the Stoics had some pretty, I think, amazing insights into relationship to death with Marcus Aurelius. It's like total phenomenon of a world leader who was the most powerful man in the world, and yet his leadership was really pretty incredible. And I think a lot of it is because having this relationship to human finitude, and allowing that to really inform who he was being as a general in war, or as a leader. And I feel like that same kind of context obviously is very different, but if you're a health professional, really understanding that, exactly what you're saying, like when someone's whole world is upended by the experience of death being here now, allowing some sense of I guess it's not the same when it's not your when it's not your specific death that you're talking about, but having that, like you were saying, that cognitive empathy where you can really do the best that you can to understand from within that person's experience.
Yeah, and it's basically, as you put it, that being towards death, as Heidegger puts it, is really just an eye towards the end, like understanding that this is part of what it means to be human. And you can't really experience your own death through another person's experience of death, but you can definitely have empathy that, the sense of temporality of somebody with a terminal diagnosis is going to change. They're going to have a phenomenological dislodging effect where their sense of time is now different because there's an end in sight, right? So getting health professionals to think through what that means and talk through what it means to have this condition or this diagnosis in a way that's empathetic is absolutely crucial if we're going to form a relationship of trust with our patients.
Yeah, that's amazing. So are you saying then that you're actually working with practitioners in this?
Yeah. Well, so we've run workshops, phenomenology of healthcare workshops, where we invite like a bunch of physicians at the health system, patients as well, physical therapists, nurses, you name it, people who do patient care. We invite them and we talk through phenomenology, and we kind of talk through how to empathize, some different ways of approaching communication in a way that shows that you care about the patient's narrative. So we've run workshops like that, but most of my work is in teaching students, so undergraduate students, and now we have doctoral students too. Training them on how to do this is really kind of my wheelhouse. That's the kind of stuff that I get excited about.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's a huge contribution. I feel like the medical world is so important for people to be able to have that approach, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the norm.
So medicine in the United States pivoted really hard towards science, in the early 1900s. So basically, we have all these practitioners who are really, really skilled when it comes to science, technology, being basically skilled technicians in that realm, but have not gotten training in, how to care for the human, the person, and how to speak with the person. So in the past couple decades, we've recognized that we pivoted way too hard towards the science of medicine and we've forgotten the art of medicine. So some of the work that I try to help out with is thinking through the implications of that shift, but also actually like talking with practitioners, clinicians, and getting them to kind of recognize that if you're not really engaging with your patients, and you're only basically merely a skilled technician, what does that mean towards your profession, but what does it mean for the patient and the level of trust that you're building with that person? So those are the kind of questions that kind of guide my work in that sphere.
Yeah, that's amazing. I do want to come. Let's put a pin in that because I do want to talk a lot about technology and some of the implications of that, and specifically, what are some potential philosophical approaches to being able to. I mean, Heidegger talks about creating a free relationship with technology and what that kind of looks like as we move forward, and as a human species, really being in the world in a way where we can do it effectively. So, but I want to take a little bit of a step back because I want to kind of understand a little bit more about, let's say, your journey into philosophy and what has led you to, let's say, some of the work that you're doing, which is obviously, it's amazing, man. I really acknowledge you for the application of what you're doing and really that important work. But in general, like, what does philosophy mean to you, and how did you wind up being a philosopher?
Well, I don't know if I'm a philosopher. I'm a philosophy professor for sure. There's probably, I think the term philosopher is kind of like I'm striving to be one. I don't think I am one yet. But in terms of getting into philosophy, well, what is it first? I think philosophy is a mode of being where your actions and your beliefs are informed by some sort of critical perspective where you've thought about it, right? So there has to be critical reflection involved, but it has to inform your life. It has to be practical. So it is important to make probably a distinction between philosophy professors who have read the canon and can teach that to students, and doing genuine philosophy where you're doing the thinking, right? You're not just telling students what these philosophers have said, but you're teaching them how to think for themselves. I mean, that's what real philosophy is to me. So how I got interested in it, how I kind of stumbled upon it is an interesting story. I literally, my first class at St. Norbert College, where I did my undergrad, was a philosophy of human nature class. And it was just a gen ed. Like, I never heard of philosophy before. Had to take this gen ed class. And we read Camus right out of the gates, The Myth of Sisyphus, which basically questions the meaning of existence. And I'd never came across that question before. Like, it just didn't show up to me given my background. And so once that question was posed, it just opened up like this whole huge different world of other questions that I had to answer. So I came at philosophy at first as just totally, it blindsided me. I didn't know what that was. And then once those questions started to be asked, I just couldn't stop questioning and asking them. And here I am. So basically, I've dedicated a life towards just pursuing truth and justice and trying to get other students to think about those issues in a critical way. As a result of just some random gen ed class that I had to take. So it's kind of I stumbled into philosophy, honestly. It wasn't like something I pursued. It just kind of happened, and then I couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. When I was at Salisbury, when I was in undergrad, I had a philosophy professor named Jerome Miller, who is going to be he's going to be one of the people that I interview. He's got a new project that he's working on, and he's got a deadline. But I'm going to be talking to him in a couple of weeks.
Nice.
And same experience, you know, he would be like crawling around on the floor and throwing erasers, and it was just like this. I was just confronted by this whole other possible way of thinking about life and these different questions. And we read Heidegger like right away. It was a philosophy of religion course for me, and so we read Heidegger was one of my first experiences. We were reading Nietzsche and Heidegger like right out of the gate, and I had this experience then, which I'll be honest, kind of dwindled over time as I got kind of farther into the academic side of it. But there was something that was ignited in me really early on, which was exactly what you're saying, this idea of philosophy as an activity, as a discipline, as a way of living, as something that has transformative power right now, you know, in life. And so it's interesting that when you were saying that earlier, you made a distinction between the discipline and, let's say, understanding the history of philosophy and the history of ideas. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, it's fascinating as well. But, you know, philosophy being a pursuit versus, you know, something that you study per se or arrive at.
Yeah, I think, you know, philosophy as an activity, it's really what it is it's an exercise of humility, because you take on these thinkers. Heidegger and Nietzsche are really good examples, where you think you kind of know the way the world works, and then somebody gives you an entirely different interpretation or an entirely different way of viewing things or seeing things or thinking about things. And you can't help but consider it and think about whether or not, you know, you can retain your belief set that you had prior to engaging in that philosopher. So, you know, doing philosophy, like when you actually have your own ideas and thinking through issues by yourself, is a pursuit, and it's constantly changing. So, you know, some of the stuff that you and I, you know, discussed back at Kent State, those issues are still very live issues, but your answers to them, they shift, and your priorities shift with time. But the whole point is to be thinking through them, and that's an endless task, I think.
Yeah, it's an infinite game. So do you see kind of the part of the joy that you have, as you know, in your position as an academic, a teacher, is helping other students orient themselves towards a new way of thinking that can open up the same kind of experience like you had?
I hope I'm able to do that. I know I've done it with some students. It's a little bit harder in my current position because I have all health science majors. So every student I have, they know what they want to do. They want to be a nurse, a sonographer, a rad tech, physical therapist. They know exactly what they want. So I think in a liberal arts setting, which is where I got my training, and I used my previous position was also at a liberal arts college, you can legitimately get students to totally rethink their perspective on the world, on reality. And there's a certain type of human who's willing to engage in those conversations authentically. So I had at my previous institution, I had philosophy majors, and I think we legitimately had those kind of transformational sorts of approaches to their identity and their being. In my current position, it's not so much of that. It's more so, how can philosophy inform your profession and inform your approach to patient care? How can I get you to think through, you know, this whole field of healthcare and its relationship to society in general? So it's more so, you know, teaching you how to think about those things, as opposed to maybe the deeper conversations of being and identity that more people that are really dialed into philosophy are much more willing to engage in.
Got it. So where you're at, it's more of coming at it from more of an applied perspective and kind of a tool that they can use in what they're already doing versus maybe some of the really meta stuff that works differently.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yep.
And how about in your own life? Like, have you had experiences in your life where maybe you had like a big obstacle or a challenge or a dark period or any time where your training in being able to think critically about life in general and, you know, just the work that you've done in philosophy has helped you get through challenging periods like that?
Yeah, I mean, philosophy is deeply personal for me. And a good example in terms of a challenge or a dark period that I've gone through is a couple of years ago when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So our school got closed down. We were teaching from home entirely. My wife also was working from home. And then we have 3 young children. One was in diapers still, the other one super still dependent. And then my daughter at the time was 5. So I had a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old while working from home, teaching 4 classes. And at that time, my wife, because of stress, she has psoriatic arthritis. So because of stress, she basically had a flare up and her knees got really big. So we go to get imaging done. They say, nothing's wrong with you. We can't see anything wrong biologically. So they give her crutches. The next night, she is in pain because of the inflammation. She tries to go downstairs to get Advil and she falls down the stairs, breaks her arm. So now we have a situation where, you know, I wake up to this thud, run as quickly as I can to get her. She's unconscious. She comes to, we go get imaging done again the next morning. Sure enough, she broke her arm. So now she's in a sling. And I've got to take on literally all of the responsibilities of the household until she's better. So now I'm caring for the kids, I'm caring for my students as much as I can, and I'm caring for my, you know, helpless wife. So that was a very difficult. I legitimately said, how am I going to do this? That was my question. And my answer actually was, I started reading Stoicism at night. So I had to harden myself to the suffering, and I had to kind of understand that that was the tool I needed at that time to kind of cope with a very difficult situation. So philosophy is interesting that way. There is an answer to whatever, you know, predicament or adversity you face. There are ways that you can maybe not thrive, but at least survive through it with the help of ideas. And, you know, a training in philosophy gives you at least a toolkit basically to take on life. And, you know, there are times in which Nietzsche's your person, and there are times that you got to search for Aristotle. You know, it just depends on the context, but certainly, you know, having that training gives you just a different sense that, you know, I need this now. I need to take on reality this way now, where if you don't have kind of a critical, reflective stance, you don't have those tools necessarily.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I definitely, I mean, I'm someone who's in long-term recovery, right? So my sort of path and navigation through addiction and recovery and all of that, dealing with all of that, was profoundly impacted by, you know, the Stoic ideas and the really the ability to be able to step back. And meditation was something that always was super helpful as well. And those two approaches seem to go really well together in my mind. Whereas meditation was a time where I could just step out of my own personal experience and my own suffering in my own world and use that let's say that space or that distance to create some reflective time. And then the Stoicism really, like when you're able to create that, how you can, turn your mind into a citadel where you are able to really, where you're able to suffer effectively, right? So instead of just being at the effect of what's happening, being able to really undergo it in a way where you can have really difficult times also, be a fruitful opportunity for transformation if you can bring the right perspective. It's like maybe there's no answers there, but it's more about how do you orient yourself towards what's happening in a way where something else can be revealed. Yeah, that's amazing.
I think that's exactly right. It's an orientation, right? It's which mode of being do I need in this space? But with meditation, which I've meditated for over a decade now, that space where you can just have a sense of calm, quiet reflection is crucial to make those decisions. Because if you're not thinking about it, you're just gonna depend upon habit and rote, whatever you've done in the past, which might not put you in the best position to thrive or flourish. So I always tell students, like, just take a little time to yourself, either in the morning or at night, where you can just shut everything off and just take a breath, right? Because I don't think students haven't been told to do that enough. And particularly in like a healthcare setting, it's so busy that, I think it's crucial not only for mental health, but for you being able to be your best self. Just to take a second and breathe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I keep wanting to go into this conversation about technology, but I think that we've been talking about Heidegger a lot, right? And the technology as a way of being, right? Everything kind of shows up in that, and it tends to be, and I think we're seeing this a lot more, the implications of this a lot more, because of the pandemic and people are at home all the time and they're on their devices all the time, and social media has become such a profound presence that people are constantly stimulated, and they're constantly being given by whatever it is that they're interacting with on their devices and stuff. And I think it's much more challenging to discover who you are when who you are is like being reflected back by all of this technology all the time. And in some of the later Heidegger stuff, which we'll get into soon when it comes to environment and music and stuff, but I think that is really, when he talks about the new beginning, or the opportunity for the world to be revealed in a different way instead of in a technological way, it is framed in terms of releasement and what he calls Gelassenheit, and this kind of receptivity. And this, I think sometimes there's even a lecture course that he did on, it was translated as mindfulness. I don't know if that's the right translation.
In the mid-30s.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it seemed that seems to be there. I mean, that this is way before even technology has become what it is now. But even there, he was in a hut in the woods and had, there was a sense that something else becomes possible, and it's able to be revealed, let's say, when you're not constantly reacting to your environment.
Yeah, that Gelassenheit, that receptivity, that mode where you're allowing things to show up as they are, to be what they are. I think that relationship towards technology is really important, and Heidegger was way ahead of his time on that concept, because particularly with, as you mentioned, social media, the content that is kind of bombarding your attention at all times with the beeps and the clicks and whatever else that looks like is really, if it's all the time, how much of that content is affecting your way of living and viewing the world, right? So there's a great power in information, even on an implicit and an unconscious level. Like, all that content does affect you. And one of the things that I do with my students is we do a smartphone detox. So we have them I don't have a smartphone, so they pick on me. I have a dumb phone. That's on purpose. That's intentional, in line with Galossite for me, at least. But one of the things that I do with the students is we do a week-long detox where we get them to kind of think through how much they're using their phone, and then we like, over time, we will start to delete apps that you don't use, defriend people that aren't really giving you positive value. And we do this. And then the last day of the 5-day detox is they have to go an hour somewhere without their phone, which proves to be very difficult if they have a genuine addiction to it. So I do think, you know, there's this relationship with that Heidegger was talking about. Like, is the technology controlling you, or are you controlling it? Is a legitimate question, given, especially as you mentioned with the pandemic, we are inundated with technology all the time. And how much of that are you choosing, and how much of that is affecting you in ways you don't even know? Those are questions that Heidegger was, even though he wasn't talking social media, those are the kind of things he was questioning.
Yeah, and specifically, one of the things that's emerged out of this time, I think, is there is let's call it a mental health crisis, where there seems to be much more conversation around, let's say, anxiety and depression and a lot of these things. It's not like those things didn't exist before. But you know, I ran a retreat in 2020 on addiction recovery, right, where I got a bunch of practitioners from a lot of different fields: personal development, meditation, you know, a lot of philosophy, lots of different fields. And the reason why we put together the retreat was because at that time there was a 30% rise in relapse in people that were just not able to deal with the stress that was happening. And then I think that there's been a knock-on effect in terms of social media is an experiment that we're going through at the moment. And one of the fears that I try not to be given by all the time, but is, what does it look like to be a human being in a future where there is no, you know, as Heidegger would say, a rootedness, you know? And that's why I think it's so important. That's why I've been more reinterested in philosophy in a lot of ways, because I think that there is something very important in the philosophical approach, like you were saying, that can think through that in a way that we don't just mindlessly drone into a future in which there's very little distinction between, you know, let's say being an AI robot or something and being a human being. And I do think that the arts and philosophy and things like that hold an answer to that question that could reveal something very important. So what are your thoughts on that? By the way, I want to really acknowledge you for having that process with your students, like the fact that you're getting them to critically think about the relationship with something that they probably never thought. They probably think about it as an aspect of themselves.
Correct. Yeah.
Getting them to critically think about that and then start deleting apps that they don't use and people that don't add value. That's extraordinary. So
yeah, that's a Heideggerian, that's applied phenomenology. That's what that is. I mean, thinking through your relationship with this device and whether or not like you actually have control over what that relationship looks like is applied phenomenology. Like, what does it mean to experience it this way? One of the things that I think is important, as you mentioned, like this shift, what does it mean to be human in a technological age, is some of the work that Richard Polt has been doing, he's a Heidegger scholar at Xavier University, but he's been talking a lot about the liquidation of reality. So the argument that he's trying to make is very Heideggerian. Heidegger has this idea that in the age of technology, things just become mere resources on hand to be manipulated. So the German is Bestand is what he says. So things just kind of get plugged into the system and they're just they're just resources, and it doesn't really matter. You can put them in, put them out, they're replaceable, interchangeable, everything just becomes that in the age of modern technology. What Polt has been writing on lately is that if things just become that, things no longer hold integrity. And if things no longer hold integrity, we've kind of lost sight of particularly like the value of what it means to be human. So some of the stuff that I get really excited about is kind of thinking through that idea of rootedness and dwelling, and actually like being present among things and thinking through the relationship with those things. So, you know, some of the stuff that I've done in the realm of music, philosophy of music type stuff, is thinking through like, what is the difference between going to an actual concert and the experience of that versus listening to music on a smart speaker, or listening to music. I like vinyl. So I play vinyl records at night after the kids go to sleep pretty much every night, read some philosophy, that's my thing. But like, you have a relationship where you're kind of allowing the music to present itself, as opposed to in a smart speaker setup, you're kind of telling the music to present itself. And if you don't like it, you immediately dispose it because you have all these others that are imminently present too in the system, the database that they have, right? So this idea of committing yourself to the experience, I think is really crucial, because otherwise it just becomes basically just fluff. Like, it doesn't matter. You're cultivating meaning by choosing where to root your attention, I guess.
Yeah, that's amazing. So tell me a little bit more about the work on music. That's interesting. But just before I forget, one of the things that I thought was very striking, I just did a course on Heidegger and technology, and I don't know where this is. You probably know better than me. But in one of the essays, Heidegger was talking about how the atom bomb had already gone off as soon as the human being discovered techne, something like that.
That's in the essay called The Turn, which is right. There's that book, The Question Concerning Technology and Other Essays. That's the second essay of that collection.
Okay. And the reason why I think that's very interesting is because in a lot of the coaching work and stuff that we do as well, right? There is this idea that there is no past in the sense of like a history, like a series of events, and the future is not something that is not yet happened. There is a conception of time where, you know, the future is already fulfilled in some sense, right? And that the inception of this privileging, let's say, of technology over, let's say, thinking. I don't know how to say this the right way, but as soon as technology becomes a privileged mode of relating to the world or having the world be revealed in some way, already in that moment, in the inception of that moment, the atom bomb's already gone off, right? Yeah. And so that, and maybe something even much worse than that, you know, yeah, could be lying in the future, and that it's already happening based on our relationship to the world. And when I read that sentence, I just thought that was extraordinary, because there is a sense in which, you know, the equivalent of whatever, you know, the atom bomb going off, there is something in our future, let's say, you know, apocalyptic or catastrophic or something, that if we don't correct our relationship and have that relationship to technology, like you were saying, are you being given by it, or are you controlling it, or is it controlling you? That's why I think this philosophy thing is so important, because if we don't rethink that relationship effectively, there is the equivalent of the atom bombs has already gone off. There is something like that is in our future.
That's exactly it. And you know, his quote, Heidegger's quote, the most thought-provoking thing in this thought-provoking time is that we are not thinking, is exactly what you're talking about. So we live, for him, it was the atomic bomb, right? For us, it's climate change. I mean, we live at a time in which we legitimately, if you read the most recent report from the IPCC from 2021, it's dire. The situation is very dire. And unless we pivot as a species towards sustainability, we are going to be in big trouble. Maybe not like apocalypse in our lifetime, but certainly it's going to get uglier. And one of the things that I've worked on is basically, in order to fix that problem of climate change, it's not just an engineering fix or a technological fix or a scientific fix. We need to change our relationship to the world. We need to change our relationship to the natural world, where things don't show up as merely resources to be optimally manipulated in the most efficient and productive way, but rather think through a more sustainable relationship that allows for us to dwell. So, I mean, those questions of how you relate to things are crucial, not only to your own sense of meaning and being, your own ontology, but also to the future of the species. Like, these are legitimate questions that philosophers should have some sort of help in guiding us in the right direction. And I don't think enough of us are working on those really kind of crucial questions as philosophy has become more specialized and academic. So that's why I do typically make that distinction between like doing philosophy and professing, right? These are not necessarily, you can do both, but doing one doesn't mean you're doing the other.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I also appreciate about the Heidegger's approach is, I think it was in the end of philosophy and the task of thinking. It wasn't that, philosophy is, or that poetry, let's say, in this sense, is better than philosophy, and that philosophy is better than science, and that it's not a chain of like one being better than the other. It's the understanding how one can give you a different orientation to the next, right? So philosophy, Heidegger was a philosopher, right? And, I think part of the reason why I found so much interest in, let's say, like you were talking before about music and the poetic, it's not necessarily about reading poetry. It's the poetic, let's say, sensibility or orientation can give philosophy a different place to look from. And then properly oriented, science, philosophy can give science a different place to, let's say, look from. And that having that orientation is critical. So what I hear you saying is that you can be doing philosophy as a discipline, but not really be engaged in that thing that's a little bit more primordial in that sense, which is the orientation towards philosophy as a practice. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think that's exactly it. And Gadamer, who's a student of Heidegger, he just says that science and technology have gotten this unassailable authority where we just assume that's it. But what philosophy can get us to do is to think through other ways of relating to the world, other ways of relating to things that are not based entirely in this technological means to end, instrumental reason approach. And Heidegger can help us, think through how to do that in a way that works given your own unique circumstances.
Yeah, and I want to hear more about the environmental stuff as well. But just before we get to that, there is a sense in which philosophy itself actually has been, I don't know if culpable is the right word, but like one thing that I think that people, maybe young students and maybe people in general, I don't know, they think of philosophy as like, oh, it's just, something that people do to think about thinking or whatever. But one of the things that I think that is important is to understand that however we think and however we view ourselves and the world and other people and the environment, it's been cultivated over time, right? It's not like we just came up with that. right? There has been a, let's say, a history of the way that we've related to those things that basically gives the perspective, I guess, in some sense of where we are now. So in terms of philosophy, where has that trajectory of viewing let's say science and technology, where we end up being a resource, like you were saying before, where did that happen in the philosophical past, I guess, or trajectory or tradition?
Well, you can kind of think through any major university in the US right now. They're going to have 20, 30 philosophers, and almost all of them are going to be doing analytic philosophy, which is really, it's logic chopping. That's what it is. You're taking arguments and you're trying to form really clear, crisp arguments regarding this or that topic, right? Which is, I mean, a highly specialized approach. And we need people doing that kind of thing. But when most of us are doing that kind of work, you lose sight of the big picture, right? We become hyper specialized, and people just kind of wonder, like, how does that connect with my everyday life? So you use the word culpable. I think the way philosophy has been, we are to some extent culpable for not asking the big questions that at the beginning of the philosophical tradition in ancient Greece, that's what they were doing. They were asking the big questions, the deep questions. What does it mean to live a meaningful life? What does it mean to flourish as a human being? What is justice? What is truth? All those big questions, right? That are now kind of like not what everyday philosophers are doing, most of them at least. What I think the continental tradition, if you want to put it that way, I don't know if that's some people don't like that language, but the people that are still asking the big questions, right, are unfortunately a very small percentage of people doing professional philosophy. So that's where I think it's important for us to kind of recognize, how does philosophy become relevant given the very real issues we face as a species, with things like climate change, as we mentioned, but also you mentioned social media, disinformation and misinformation. How can we help think through those big issues that threaten things like, the habitability of humans, but also, democracy itself, when people are believing in things that are patently false. And they've been fed this through social media feeds and algorithms that don't even have a human behind them, right? So those are the kind of questions that I think philosophers need to be asking, and they need to speak in a way that any educated human being can understand, and not use hyper-specialized logical sorts of language where you need a PhD to understand what the person's talking about. So I do think, where we went wrong, I don't know if you want to put where we went wrong, but the way, how this happened is we started to basically become hyper-specialized, like I do epistemology, but I don't do anything else. Well, if you're a philosopher, what you are is you're a professional thinker, and you should be able to apply that thought to anything. Like if you're doing it, if you're doing it holistically, right? And part of this also is you're supposed to have a research agenda for this very small topic, and you're supposed to publish on that very small topic. But we're boxing ourselves in unnecessarily. So, I think you can philosophize about legitimately anything. It's just a matter of critically thinking through, what does it mean for something to show up that way? What are the implications down the line if we keep going down this path? Those kind of questions, right? That's all philosophical in nature, but we have to do it in a way that anybody can understand, and that's something that we've been lacking, I think.
Yeah, I heard Yuval Harari.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's lots of things that I have trouble with in the way that they're thinking, that like the transhumanist, kind of approach. But one thing that was really struck me in an interview that he was having with someone, I can't remember who it was, but the way that he was talking about AI was much more terrifying than I think the way that AI has been thought of in the past. Like as kids, we grew up watching the Terminator, and it's like, that's the big threat, that the robots take over, and, the humans become marginalized, and the thing that we created destroys us, and it's the form of like robots walking around with machine guns. And the thing that I was genuinely terrified about, because I don't, those types of apocalyptic visions, I'm like, yeah, okay. But the thing that I was genuinely terrified about was when he started talking about marketing, and he started talking about AI as the control essentially of our thoughts, and how these algorithms are out there. And I remember the one specific thing that he mentioned was that, like, basically with these smart TVs and phones and everything, that if he was born today, Google would know that he was gay way before he ever did, right? By following his eye patterns and being able to distinguish where his preferences of vision were, and being able to distinguish, okay, this is who he is. And then from a very young age, and in a very covert way, start marketing and start giving the things that are preferential for him, and being able to essentially guide people's attention,
right,
and then alter their behavior by using these subtle cues and different sort of marketing strategies.
Sure.
And and thinking about that in terms of, let's say mind control, for a lack of a better term, but thinking about that as the end of thinking, and really profoundly manipulating, the way that we relate to ourselves, other people, the world, what's true, and have the way that the big fear is like this eradication of truth.
Right.
And when I heard him say that, I'm like, okay, that's terrifying. Robots, I have no problem with. Maybe that's naive on my end, but when I heard him say that, so when you said disinformation and the big looming disaster that is, if we don't critically think through this, that occurs to me as something that's very dangerous. So what is your answer to that?
Yeah, I just wrote a paper on this.
Okay.
So there's a professor out in New York who's named Mackenzie Wark, I think is the name, who talks through how capitalism is dead, is the name of the book. But the argument is basically that in this new era, this era of information, basically what you end up with is information has this asymmetrical sort of power, where you give some information about yourself, right? So you'll give, maybe in order to have my kids go to school, I have to show my address, right? I give information to something that's bigger, and everybody else is doing the same thing. So they end up with this huge database of information in an aggregate, and you have just this very small amount of power. And what companies are recognizing is that Bacon was right, Francis Bacon, knowledge is power. Well, information's power. There's power in information to manipulate people's thoughts and behaviors. And this isn't like 1984 Big Brother stuff. It's even more terrifying than that, wherein you are basically legitimately rearranging people's thoughts to align with corporate interests by, a nudged advertisement based off of consumer behavior. So you might ask, okay, well, that was nice that Google recognized that I looked this up and then gave me something that's maybe useful for me to purchase. But the question is, if you purchased that item, did you genuinely choose that, or were you manipulated to think you wanted it, right? So the word that in the paper I wrote, the word that I used for that is interpolation. So interpolation is a term from Althusser, who makes the argument that when you think that you're acting in accordance with your own interests, but those interests have been manipulated by somebody else, you've been interpolated. So essentially, you've been manipulated to think that you're doing something autonomous when in fact, all along, somebody had this planned. So, one of the things that you can think through is at Google, we have these people who have jobs. They are called attention engineers. They're legitimately, they're trying to train us to put our attention towards whatever it is that they're marketing towards. And so when you have even a title like that is terrifying to me. Insofar as, if there's one thing humans are, we are autonomous. We should be treated as such. I mean, Kant got that right. But with the technological age, there's a legitimate threat there that I don't think people are necessarily even recognizing as much as it needs to be a conversation, that an urgent conversation. It's not happening enough, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, that's scary. I mean, I think that's where a lot of this, it's interesting. This is one of the things we're grappling with in the technology seminar, where we're talking about, basically Heidegger and technology, is that our professor, Johannes, was using technology to lead conversations, to have people think for themselves and come up with their own conclusions and like that. And it's like, Heidegger was saying that where the danger is, right, so is the saving grace or the saving power, right? Yeah. And that if cultivating that free relationship to technology is going to, it has the power to usher in, let's say, a new way of being. And the danger, I guess, that is what Heidegger calls the Gestalt, like this, the technological way of being is exactly what you're saying, that these corporate interests get a hold of this, get a hold of our attention. That's exactly what you're saying. I think that's the scary part, is that your attention is oriented towards what's important to you. And if someone can control your attention, they can actually manipulate what you think is important.
Correct. Yeah.
To you. And that is critical. And I will say that one of the reasons why I started this podcast, The Examined Life, is I do see one possibility of having the conversations that need to have in, let's say, a town square or public forum, is things like YouTube, is these channels where people can get together and talk about dangerous ideas, things that are happening, as long as they don't get censored. Right. Then, it can be both a place where idiots go to talk about nothing, but it can also be a place where people have really important conversations that are, let's say, against the potential prevailing narrative that's in no one's best interest. Right. So it's very complicated, right? Because it serves both of those purposes, but it's like we need to get more momentum and more weight in this group of people who are thinking clearly through important topics in kind of public settings, so to combat that power that is happening in behind the scenes, because it is covert and it is so dangerous. Because if it goes, I'm trying to just think through what you just said. So if it gets so deep, and who knows whether we're already there, I don't know, where people can no longer see that possibility is happening, it's just what's happening. Yes. Then that ability to course correct gets kind of, it goes away. Right. So what do you I mean, what do you see is that I was listening to just one more thing. I was listening to Johannes talk to Justin Murphy, who's like another philosopher, and they were talking about Deleuze and Heidegger and their different approaches to technology and trying to figure out, is there a way out? And there wasn't really an answer, but I think it's the question that's important. I don't know.
Well, you raise a couple of really important points. One of them is that technology can be used for very good things, obviously, right? So you can, remember Candy Crush was like a big thing a decade ago. You could use technology literally to play Candy Crush all day, but you could also use it to have really legitimate conversations about important topics, which is what your podcast is doing, right? So I guess the biggest thing to kind of think through is what Heidegger is trying to get us to do is to think through other ways of looking at the world, right? What really bothered him was thinking that there's only one way. And he wanted us to open up to different ways of thinking about our relationship to the world, such that we don't have a myopic, view of reality. And he was obviously worried about technology being the view, where that Gestalt, that enframing, the frame in which everything is kind of understood as Bestand, as a mere resource on hand to be manipulated, gets so bad that even humans become mere resources to be manipulated. And that's what we're seeing happening with, the manipulation of entities like Google. But also, I think about this in terms of being a professor with our learning management system. I can see if you viewed this lecture, I can see if you downloaded the reading that I posted, I can see how long you've been in the course this week, right? And that information might help me. If a student's struggling, I can look and be like, okay, well, you weren't in the course. That's probably why you're struggling. But it can also, it's a little eerie, right? The surveillance is a little bit eerie in terms of the opportunity. If somebody has all that information, the opportunity to exploit that power is clearly evident. So, as much as, we have clearly shifted towards this era of data analytics, it can be used for good, but there's also great danger in it as well, depending on some of the decisions that we still need to make as a society. And I think, Nate, you're right. Are we already too far gone? I think that's a legitimate question. And I don't know if I have an answer, but getting a critical stance, I think, is the first step.
Yeah. Okay. So we don't have a whole too much longer, but I'm given that question, right? So I know that some of your recent work, I'm looking up your work, right? So there's one on Heidegger and the environment and one on Heidegger and music. So, and based on what the conversation that we're having now, I can see why those things have been important to you, right? Because you see those as potential, you're thinking through ideas that are, grappling with these really difficult questions. So tell me a little bit about, first of all, why you write on what you write on, and then why did you choose the environment and music specifically as topics that you wanted to engage in deeply? So
my first book is Heidegger and Music, and which was published in 2016. And really, it's a phenomenology of climate change, of how the human relationship to the natural world, how that has changed over time, and what it looks like now given this crisis. So that's the book. That's basically using Heidegger as the lens to think through those questions. If you think about the people who work in climate ethics today, a lot of them are analytic philosophers, as we talked about earlier, who are trying to give you just like really clean arguments regarding this issue. But what's missing in applied ethics like that is like the whole picture. So the relationship as such with reality is missing in those conversations. How does the world show up to us given this historical context is the kind of question that Heidegger would ask. So what I kind of did in that work is I tried to think through, okay, like did the world show up in ancient Greece? How did that shift in medieval times? How did that shift with the scientific revolution in the modern period? And what does it look like now? And how are our ideas that have been handed down to us, how are they possibly, potentially dangerous? And which ideas could we use to shift towards a more sustainable path? So that's the question of that work. And really, Gelassenheit, that whole attitude of openness, receptivity towards things, allowing things to be as they are, as opposed to subsuming them with your own interest, is really a key component of getting us to kind of think through, what does it mean for a natural entity to be what it is, as opposed to merely seeing it as a resource. So we have kind of a narrative that has been built that we are kind of masters of nature, masters of reality. But that narrative has gotten us into trouble now, and we need to pivot. So the question is kind of like, which tools from our intellectual traditions can we use to help us pivot? So the question of like, why do I write on things like the environment? I just think that particular issue is so urgent, and the people that have been working on it, I think, are not getting the whole picture. So Heidegger can help us get a wider perspective. In terms of music, I have a really strong interest in music. I've never taken a class in aesthetics, don't really claim to be an expert in that sphere, but I find myself writing on music because I feel like our approach to music has become cheapened, has become leveled down, where we just kind of put out these pop hits. They all kind of have a similar beat. They have pretty superficial sort of content. And, we play it for a while, and then we just insert something else. And it's the same sort of thing. And then you insert something else. But a genuine relationship to music, at least what I try to argue in Heidegger and music in my chapter, is where you can legitimately be opened up to a new world as a result of a musical experience. So music as art is at risk in the digital age, in my opinion, insofar as you're not really allowing yourself to even have an experience, but rather it's kind of just background noise, or it's merely there for pleasure. But what I want to try to argue is that a genuine experience with music gets you to think, and gets you to think through your own values. So the example I use is Woodstock. That festival, peace, love, and music, really allowed people to live differently for a little while. Obviously, the hippie dream died shortly thereafter, but thinking through what can we learn from that? How can we shift our way of being as a result of a musical experience like that is, I think, a worthy question. And what sorts of the way in which you experience music, the context in which you experience music is going to matter too. So, those kind of questions, I think, it's phenomenology. It's the way in which you experience the world, and what matters to you, and how does it show up as mattering, are the questions that kind of guide my thought. And then in regard to medical ethics, again, it's just kind of one of those things. It's so crucial to respect people, and it's being lost with the training that we have right now in healthcare, that like somebody's got to do that. Somebody's got to get back to that. So the things that kind of interest me, things that I think are critical and important to talk about, but also things that just genuinely I like, right? Which would be music.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, what I hear in what you're saying, and I think of it as well, with the phenomenon of, let's say, rituals. And, specifically, let's say ancient rituals and, coming rite of passages and different rituals that have been alive in our tradition that have in most leveled down, to use it like Heidegger's term. But in what you were saying is that this sense of the sacred, music can evoke something, right? An experience of, if you don't like the term God, right? An experience of something that is beyond me,
Yeah.
and that's shared.
Yeah.
And the same thing with nature and the environment. Like being in recovery and doing this work for a long time, like one of the things that is the most healing is simply walking in the woods,
Yeah.
being in nature, experiencing that, right? There is some connection, let's say, that happens if you're not on your smartphone and, if you're actually present and you're being with your experience. And I think music also has that same, has that capacity. Nature has that same capacity. And then, I've been just kind of observing a lot of the work that's been done recently on plant medicine.
Yeah.
And part of the plant medicine thing, which is transformative, is obviously there's a psychedelic component to it, right? But and so many people get stopped there because they, psychedelic is a drug is bad, we don't want to go there. But it's, what's interesting is actually what the psychedelic experience opens up. And it's something in the same world of, a connection with nature, an experience of something greater, like the participation of, let's say, my little ego in something collective that reveals a way of relating to, let's say, the earth and other people, where it's almost it almost becomes impossible to manipulate someone and to degrade your environment when there's an identification there, right? And there's something very important, I think, in what you were saying, that that there's also a relationship between human beings, where because of the interfaces of, devices and things, it's like that humanity element is missing. The sacredness of the other is missing in such a way that it's so easy to relate to other people through that kind of calculative type of thinking.
Yep.
So I see all of that. I can see how, like, the work that you're doing is all tied together.
It absolutely is. And kind of like what you just said, this idea of the sacred is really, to me, related to death, which is what we started with. So, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in an afterlife. But there's this sense that, some things are deeply meaningful. And I'm okay using the word sacred as long as there's no religious connotation. But music and the natural world, they are that for me, right? And they are basically a connection to something greater, as you put it. When we're only kind of engaging with technology as a means to an end, and relationships with others even instrumentally as a means to an end, you're losing, something that can make your life deeply meaningful. And if you only get one shot at this life, and there is an end in sight, making your life meaningful, like intentionally choosing to surround yourself with things that matter, relationships, human relationships, or the quality of music, or whatever it is, but that choice is absolutely crucial, because this is the best we can do, given who we are, what we are.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. And I mentioned it a couple of times, but the John Vervaeke's YouTube series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. One of the reasons why I resonate with his work so much is, I wouldn't say I'm an atheist. I would say that it doesn't really matter. Like, I'm not moved in any way in either direction. And when people talk about God, what I hear is, some sort of universal connection that we all share, and that includes the earth itself. And I think that the Native Americans, you watch Avatar or something, right? Like the Native American perspective, there's something deeply right about the way that they related to, you kill a buffalo and then you pray over it, and you take its bones and you grind it up and you give it back to the earth. Like, there's something very important there. But I think, his work in particular, exactly what you were saying, this idea of meaning, is so critical. And it's exactly this kind of work that you're talking about that can awaken the desire again, this like eros or something for meaning and purpose and passion, and not something that's connected to some material end or something like that, but the love of the process or whatever, something like that is really important. And that's why death, I think, is so critical, and in later Heidegger, when he talks about the mortals, right, the fourfold, the gods, the humans, the sky and the earth, regardless of, even if God is something that's important to you, it's not really for me, but if it was, the fourfold is still, the concept is still there. It's the relationship that you have, whatever that means to you. And the thing is, why it's so important is exactly what you were saying earlier on, which is, I think, one of the most productive things about this experience of death, let's say, is the humility and the respect and the finitude that comes with that. And if you can allow that to give your thinking and acting and, the way that you relate to your own life, the environment, other people, there's something very profound that comes with that humility, which is a respect and a reverence for others, the world, and the finitude, the fact that, if you only get one of these, how do we participate in the most meaningful way?
That's precisely it. That is exactly it. And really, if we're too plugged in, to kind of bring it back to technology, and everything becomes means to an end, I think we're doing it wrong, honestly. And I think about some of my friends who have taken up a profession really for more so for money, for monetary reasons, materialistic reasons. There's just a lack of happiness. There's a lack of purpose. There's a lack of, that eros, as you put it, the passion, the love to do, the process itself, to teach, to think together, right? That's really, Heidegger got that right, that we have this relationship to meaning that really makes us who we are. We care that things matter. And if we are doing things for more superficial, surface level sorts of things, it's inevitably going to lead to an existential crisis. It's going to lead to problems down the line, because you're not feeding that internal drive that makes you what you are, makes humans what they are. So I think in your work of coaching, like just that relationship building and experiencing the growth with somebody is the same thing in teaching, right? Thinking through an issue with somebody and coming upon, maybe you disagree, but thinking together and critically understanding why you believe what you believe and altering if you have to in accordance with new evidence. That's the task of philosophy, but that's the task of what it means to be human too. That is deep in the core of what we are, is to think through those things. And unfortunately, we have a lot of opportunities of distraction given our modern technological age, where we're not really heeding this deep need. And your podcast and alternative ways to kind of get people to think and outside the box, that's why those things are so absolutely crucial, because I think it's just tied to that human need.
Yeah. And there's something that you said that I really if you keep following that way of living, the existential crisis is coming, right, at some point. And it reminds me I don't want to get too deeply into philosophical terms that not everybody will understand, but in being in time, right? And I think about this all the time, because in the coaching world, I use this as a rubric for helping people understand what they believe, what they already believe about themselves, other people, the world, and all of that. And how most of it, if not all of it, is not their own. It's not they didn't choose to believe that. They didn't just they didn't critically think through that. And Heidegger has this idea of das Man, right? And this kind of collective identity that happens. And that when, you know, when you get in that, right, there, first of all, it's temporal, meaning, you know, let's say the Das Man is different for, you know, different people in different cultures and different times or whatever. But the phenomenon of this sort of collective identity is real. And, you know, unless you are trained to think critically about that, or something happens, you know, this Ivan Ilyich moment where death comes in, or something comes in and it wipes away that sort of collective meaning in an existential moment. Heidegger calls it anxiety in that book or whatever. Nothing alters, and yet everything alters, right? The perception, because this collective way of thinking is kind of wiped away, and you're left with, you know, this ability to potentially think through things newly. So I thought there's got to be something that, like, as an access to altering, because otherwise, you know, we're just going to keep getting swept along with the way that one already thinks.
Right. That's right. And the idea of the they, or Das Man, the collective identity that you're talking about, you can kind of see it with, as we were talking about, social media feeds, or even, and I'm from Green Bay, and people, you know, we talk Packers a lot here, and just the way in which people talk about how the Packers are doing, you can tell right away whether it's informed by local talk radio or not, because it's the same story. And then the question is this coming from you, or is this kind of our collective way of approaching the team this year? You know, so even like little things like that, you can legitimately think through, are these thoughts my own? Or, you know, am I being genuine? Am I being real, authentic with this topic of conversation? Or am I just kind of, you know, speaking as one speaks, given the context? But those are philosophical questions that I think any human being needs to ask if they want to be real with themselves, if they want to have an authentic relationship to themselves as well as with others. And again, if you're not trying to do that, what are you doing? Like that's the best you can do, I think. So philosophy can help you think through that in a way that maybe other disciplines can do it too, but philosophy is uniquely positioned to help you think through that.
Yeah, I was gonna say something about the political landscape as well. You know, like there's so much of that going on. This kind of the tribalism. It's like, what side are you on? And it's like, how does the orientation become, we're all on the same side?
Yeah.
And then we can productively disagree in a way. You know, I always think about in one of the Plato's dialogues where you're rubbing two sticks together, right? And that's how you create fire. You know, it's like, you know, this idea that I have a particular perspective about maybe what I think is right or whatever, but I'm looking for other people to rub my ideas up against, because I know I can't have all of the answers.
Yeah.
And that simply by rubbing up against other ideas, a third thing can emerge. And I feel like that relationship, you know, John Vervaeke calls it dialogos.
Yeah.
And what he's doing is kind of bringing back this Socratic and this Platonic idea that engaging with ideas in a dialogos with other people, also exactly what you were saying before, involves this profound willingness to be open, and a humility and a commitment to truth and beauty and goodness and meaning first, and then you know, setting maybe what I think is aside, or a commitment to what I think is aside, in a willingness to cultivate dialogue in a way that, you know, hoping that you're wrong in some sense. Like, how can I reveal where I'm just being that's the one and being dragged along in a way where it's like, okay, I'm just going to constantly be on this never-ending search for discovering a different perspective that might reveal a different way of being.
And that brings us right back to what we were talking about with AI, right? With people's viewpoints, political viewpoints are now very much linked with their social media posts. And once you go down a certain path, like we can manipulate you to give you content that just entrenches that viewpoint to a point where we legitimately are not even living in the same reality because we don't view the world the same way, and we can't even have a conversation. Which is where the political divisiveness really stems from. But what we're starting to kind of see is that that's a threat to democracy, obviously. And we need to find ways to have legitimate dialogue, legitimate conversations in terms of, let's not just entrench, our own attitudes, but let's think through your perspective and your values and your priorities and how they differ. And how can we kind of come to terms with respecting each other's autonomy in a way that does have humility, does have some empathetic stance to it, which, when you're just kind of in battered, tunneling down and putting your feet down and saying, no, this is the way it is, we're not actually getting anywhere, right? You're only entrenching your own mentality. So I do think like it's very much linked with having an attitude of openness and willing to be vulnerable enough to admit, that might be a bias, right? So there's humility in that, but we tend not to want to display that in certain contexts, and social media is one of them.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is maybe a good place to wrap up. So based on what you just said, right? So this podcast is called The Examined Life. And one of the reasons why I wanted to name it that is, first of all, I think that's got to be the orientation of, at least the way that I live and the way that I encourage other people to live. Like, examine everything that you think, do, say critically, and just keep checking in. Is that my thought and not? The other part is because, Socrates, one of the reasons I have such a deep and profound respect for, at least what we know of Socrates, is this idea, is a cultivated sense that I don't know.
Yeah.
And this willingness to like constantly be open in some sense, right? So what does an examined life mean to you, Dr. Rentmeester?
Yeah. Well, I have a profound respect for Socrates as well. And his whole idea that the unexamined life is not worth living really does hit home for me. I think that's exactly right. And honestly, it's really tied with his famous quote, "Know thyself," right? You got to check yourself, right? So there are times in which you kind of think you're better than you are, or you think you know more than you actually know. But the thing about philosophy and examination in general, critical reflection in general, is that the more you investigate, the more you recognize that you don't know, right? That the people who think they know, the ones who are cocksure, are the ones who are typically like unintelligent. The intelligent people are the ones that are more hesitant, and they understand that there are different ways to look at this, right? Bertrand Russell has some kind of quote that goes along those lines. But basically, the examined life really is critically reflecting on what matters to you and what relationships mean to you and how they affect your orientation to reality, understanding full well that we are finite. And again, if this is our one shot, if this is what we get, let's make sure we've thought about it. that's what examination should do. If you're just kind of on autopilot, you're doing it wrong.
Love it, buddy. Well, thank you so much for, being willing to come on and have this conversation today. I've been excited about having this conversation for a while. It's been, I don't know how long it's been since we were, having philosophical conversations over beers years ago, but it's been a while.
It's been a little bit.
Yeah, so thanks for being willing to come on. I will leave the links to the books that you were talking about, Heidegger and the Environment, Heidegger Music, and anything else that you share with me that you think people would be, if they want to come and check out more of your work. But is there any other place that people can find you? Obviously not on your smartphone, but any place where people can interact with your
Yeah,
work?
I'm on the only social media I have is LinkedIn. So I'm on that. And then I'm on academia.edu. I have all my work on that page. So I write on pretty much anything. I've written on punk rock. I've got a new one coming out on The Godfather. I've talked about plant ethics. So what, you talked about plant medicine. I've written on that. I'm all over the place. So, hopefully there's something that piques attention and interest, given I write on pretty much anything that interests me, and hopefully there's overlap.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, anybody that's out there that's watching this, if you have your own podcast or whatever the case may be, hit Casey up on LinkedIn. He's a really fantastic dialogue partner. So thanks again, brother. I love you. Thank you for coming on today. I appreciate your time and really fantastic conversation. I know that we could probably do this for another 10 hours, but we'll leave it here for now. And, maybe we'll come back and do it again on a different topic or on a different day. But thanks for kicking off this little adventure with me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nate. Been an honor.
Cheers.